Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to Rome. Not the postcard Rome of elegant fountains, Baroque churches, and polite espresso drinking. No, we're sliding much further back, to a time when the city smelled less like roasted chestnuts and more like unwashed tunics, open sewers, and occasionally, blood. So, if you've ever thought you could survive as a gladiator, just pause, settle in, and let's gently walk through why you absolutely wouldn't. And of course, why most of them didn't either. First, picture yourself waking up not in your apartment, but in a ludus, a gladiator school. It sounds like a fun camp, but replace camp with prison, and fun with daily reminders that you are disposable. Gladiators didn't exactly apply for the job through some heroic sign-up sheet. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or unlucky debtors. Some volunteered, which is like volunteering to become both a celebrity and a chew toy for the empire. Your bed? Rough wooden planks, maybe a thin mat if the lanista, the trainer who owns you, was feeling generous. Privacy doesn't exist. Personal space doesn't exist. Hygiene barely exists. You live shoulder to shoulder with dozens of other men, most of whom are just as terrified and just as smelly as you. And then comes breakfast. Don't imagine eggs, bacon, and toast. Think more along the lines of barley gruel, thick, bland, and filling. Gladiators were nicknamed barley men, not because anyone thought it was cute, but because their diet was basically grain, beans, and more grain. The empire wanted them to be bulky, not lean and cut like actors in modern sword and sandal movies, more like living battering rams, padded with fat to survive a few more cuts in the arena. Now you shuffle out to train. Training sounds glamorous. It isn't. It's a long, exhausting loop of drills, weapon practice, and sparring under the constant eye of instructors. These instructors were often retired gladiators who, unlike you, managed not to die, yet still carried the scars and bitterness of years spent as Rome's entertainment puppets. They yell at you. They hit you. They remind you that if you slip in the arena, you won't get a do-over. You'll just get a sword in the ribs. And remember, you're not training with foam sticks. You're wielding wooden swords that are nearly as heavy as the real ones. The Romans believed in training with worse gear than you'd use in the arena, because of course they did. The idea was that when the day came, you'd find the real weapon, slightly less miserable. By now, your muscles ache, your hands blister, and you're aware that tomorrow will look exactly the same. Unless, of course, your number gets called. That's when the fun begins. Let's say you're chosen for a match. No, you don't get to pick your weapon. The lanista decides. Maybe you're given a sword and shield, making you a murmillo. Maybe you get a trident and a net, making you a retiarius. Which, let's be honest, feels less like combat and more like being forced to play fisherman against a man with an actual blade. Each style came with its own risks and humiliations. The match itself? It isn't one long dramatic duel with slow motion combat and thunderous speeches. It's sweaty, frantic, awkward, and terrifying. The crowd roars, but not for your benefit. They roar because they've already had lunch, maybe a jug of cheap wine, and they'd like to see if your insides look different than the last guy's. Here's a fun bedtime thought. The Colosseum, that great marvel of Roman architecture, could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. That's basically a full modern football stadium, except no one's cheering for a touchdown. They're cheering to see if you bleed nicely. Imagine being shoved into the middle of that, half blind from the sun, sweating, dehydrated, and aware that tens of thousands of people have gathered to watch you, possibly fail to breathe. And let's not pretend you have any real medical insurance. If you get wounded, you don't stroll off to a clinic. You're dragged away, patched up with whatever herbs, bandages, or vague optimism the Romans had on hand. If you're lucky, you survive. If not, the sand gets raked over, and the next poor soul takes your place. Now, here's the irony. Gladiators were both despised and adored. Romans considered them dishonorable, filthy, socially tainted, but also glamorous. Women wrote love notes to them. Children idolized them. Wealthy men collected them like expensive horses. You were simultaneously a rock star and a disposable plaything, which sounds exciting until you remember that rock stars at least usually die of old age or their own questionable decisions. And yes, there were victories. Some gladiators survived years, earned money, and eventually freedom. A wooden sword, called oddities, symbolized retirement. But for most, the oddities remained a distant dream, more myth than reality. So, when people daydream about striding into the Colosseum with a sword, picture the less glamorous truth. The heat, the smell, the crowd baying for blood, the knowledge that you're not there because you want to be, but because Rome wanted a show. And that, in short, is why you probably wouldn't survive even a single day as a Roman gladiator. But let's drift gently forward, because the world has never run out of ways to make life both fascinating and miserable. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake after the Gladiator fiasco, congratulations. Though honestly, that probably means you're braver than the rest of us. Tonight, we're drifting into another corner of the medieval world, one that was a little less glamorous than knights in armor or ladies in silk gowns. We're going to spend some time with the people who did the jobs nobody else wanted, the work that made medieval society run, in the most literal sense, usually involving blood, mud, or worse. So, tuck yourself in, dim your lantern, and prepare to hear about lives that were sticky, smelly, and strangely important. Let's start with the gong farmer. No, not a cheerful medieval musician hitting bronze discs all day. A gong farmer was the charming title for the man who cleaned out privies, which means, yes, we are talking about the poor souls who spent their nights shoveling human waste out of cesspits beneath castles, monasteries, and townhouses. The word gong comes from the Old English gang, which just meant to go. So in a way, a gong farmer was literally a going farmer. A farmer of, well, what people left behind. And if you think your job is thankless, imagine wading waist deep in a slurry of everyone else's digestive decisions, working strictly after dark so that nobody respectable had to actually watch you do it. Naturally, the pay was slightly better than the average day laborer, because you had to bribe people to do this at all. But the stench followed them everywhere. It soaked into their clothes, their skin, their hair. Gong farmers weren't exactly welcome dinner guests, though they made sure dinner could exist without the entire city drowning in filth. Now let's drift from waste to death, because apparently, medieval life was a constant balancing act between the two. Enter the executioner. You might imagine a grim man in a black hood, swinging an axe with clean precision. In reality, executioners were often botched amateurs who got stuck with the role because they were already outcasts. Some were former criminals who agreed to take on the job as a way of avoiding their own punishment. Others inherited the role because, apparently, some families just couldn't catch a break. The work wasn't glamorous. A botched beheading could take several strikes, each more awkward than the last. Hanging was even less elegant, since ropes had a habit of breaking or strangulation dragging on far too long. People jeered if you failed, and even when you succeeded, no one wanted to shake your hand afterward. Yet, executioners often became strange celebrities. People feared them but also needed their services, which meant they occupied this weird limbo of being both avoided and bribed. Some used their position to make extra money selling the clothes or hair of the condemned, because why let anything go to waste? Speaking of waste, let's talk about tanners. These were the folks who made leather, which sounds respectable enough, until you realize the process involved soaking animal hides in urine and dung for weeks at a time to soften them. The smell was indescribable. Tanning districts were usually shoved far outside city walls, because the stench carried on the wind like an invisible curse. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep with rotting hides and vats of dog excrement just down the road. Not ideal. The tanner's job was hands-on, literally. They waded in barefoot, stirring hides through foul liquids, then scraping away fat, hair, and flesh. Their skin absorbed it all. Their clothes were ruined, and their neighbors, if they had any left, probably resented their existence. Still, the demand for leather was constant. Shoes, belts, saddles, armor, book covers, all required the unpleasant labor of tanners. Society wore the fruits of their misery, while pretending not to notice them. Now, if you're still awake, let's wander over to the medieval barber surgeon, because apparently, in the Middle Ages, a haircut and an amputation came from the same man. The barber's red and white pole comes from this very tradition. White for bandages, red for blood. Barbers pulled teeth, lanced boils, and occasionally sawed off limbs, all without anesthetic. The instruments were sharp but not exactly sterile. Infection was common. Screaming was guaranteed, and success was a matter of luck as much as skill. Yet people lined up anyway, because what choice did they have? Physicians, the learned, doctors, were expensive, rare, and often more interested in quoting Galen than actually treating patients. Barbers were accessible, practical, and willing to get their hands dirty. And if you died in the chair, well, at least your hair looked decent. And then there were the leech collectors. These hardy souls waded into marshes with bare legs, letting blood-sucking worms attach themselves. Once the leeches were good and full, collectors peeled them off and sold them to apothecaries for medical use. Because, of course, medieval medicine believed draining a little blood was the key to balancing the body's humors. Collectors were bitten raw, sometimes developed infections, and basically served as walking bait for the creatures. But they kept going, because the demand for leeches was endless. Finally, let's drift over to a job that was less gruesome but equally despised. The medieval rat catcher. Cities swarmed with rodents. carrying fleas, diseases, and general chaos. Rat catchers used traps, dogs, or just their own hands to reduce the problem. Sometimes they even paraded live rats through the streets as proof of their services, which is the sort of show and tell no child ever asked for. The irony, of course, is that rat catchers themselves often spread vermin further, since their cages were hardly airtight. Still, they played an essential role in keeping homes, granaries, and castles from being eaten from the inside out. So there you have it, the forgotten workers of medieval Europe. They were avoided, ridiculed, or feared, yet their labor kept cities alive, literally. Without gong farmers, executioners, tanners, barber surgeons, leech collectors, and rat catchers, the medieval world would have collapsed into filth, chaos, and disease even faster than it already did. And now, as we drift away from their smelly, bloody, exhausting routines, you might take a quiet breath of relief. Because at least, whatever problems modern life gives you, it probably doesn't involve fishing leeches off your ankles or shoveling someone else's dinner out of a cesspit. Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting away from the noisy amphitheaters of gladiators and the stinking jobs of medieval Europe. Instead, we're heading somewhere warmer and drier, the land of golden sands, enormous stone monuments, and toilets. Yes, because if there's one thing history likes to remind us, it's that no matter how grand the civilization, everybody still had to go. Ancient Egypt has always had this kind of glossy reputation. A land of eternal stone pyramids, elegant gods painted in perfect profile, pharaohs wrapped in linen, and laid in jewel-encrusted coffins. But beneath all that glamour was, of course, the simple fact of being human. And being human means eating, drinking, and eventually facing the question, where do you put it when it comes back out again? So tonight, we're taking a very gentle, slightly unfortunate, but surprisingly fascinating trip into the world of ancient Egyptian bathroom habits. Settle in, maybe light a candle, maybe avoid eating hummus while listening, and let's start with the basics. What counted as a toilet on the banks of the Nile? Toilets fit for a pharaoh. Sort of. Now, if you imagine a royal Egyptian palace, you probably think of gold-covered thrones, perfumes drifting through the air, and servants fanning the king with palm leaves. And yes, some of that did exist. But tucked away in a quieter corner, there might also be a seat carved from stone, with a hole in the middle. That, essentially, was the royal toilet. It wasn't glamorous. In fact, the pharaoh's bathroom was a stone block or a wooden stool with a hole cut out. Beneath it, a pot would be placed, ready to collect what needed to be collected. And it's worth pausing here to appreciate the sheer lack of privacy. Even pharaohs, considered half divine, weren't exactly shutting the door for a little me time. Servants were usually involved. The business of ruling Egypt was apparently a very public business. And in case you're wondering, yes, some of these stone toilet seats have actually been found by archaeologists. They're heavy, cold, and extremely practical, because nothing says God King like sitting on a carved granite block and hoping it isn't too chilly in the morning. The everyday Egyptian toilet experience. For ordinary Egyptians, things were much less comfortable. Most people didn't have a bathroom at home. Instead, they relied on basic pit latrines, or, more often, just a ceramic pot in the corner of their house. Archaeologists have found quite a few of these chamber pots, usually made of clay with a rounded base. After use, the pot was emptied outside, or, if you were feeling especially civic-minded, into a larger pit somewhere near the house. This brings us to the question of smell. Ancient cities weren't exactly paragons of hygiene. Streets often doubled as open sewers, with waste thrown out into the road, left to dry in the Egyptian sun, which sounds unpleasant enough. But of course, there was also livestock wandering around. Donkeys, goats, chickens, all adding their own contributions. So if you're picturing ancient Thebes as a sparkling city of temples, just know that a lot of it smelled like, well, humanity at its most honest. Toilet paper, or lack thereof. Of course, going is only half the story. What about cleaning up afterward? Modern toilet paper didn't exist, obviously. Instead, Egyptians used whatever was available. Smooth river pebbles, fragments of broken pottery, even handfuls of sand. Yes, sand, which gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, rough around the edges. We know this thanks to preserved scraps found in rubbish heaps, along with wall paintings that suggest rather creative hygiene practices. To be fair, it wasn't unique to Egypt. The Greeks, later on, also favored broken pottery shards, which they called pissoi, because nothing says civilization like scraping yourself with the remnants of yesterday's dishes. One wonders if there was a social hierarchy even in bathroom supplies. Perhaps the wealthy had polished pebbles, while the poor had to make do with sand. It's a slightly undignified thought, but very on brand for the ancient world. Public toilets, by accident, unlike the Romans, who later built large public latrines with long benches and flowing water. The Egyptians didn't really invest in shared facilities, but cities were crowded, and when nature called, people didn't always make it home in time, which meant streets, alleyways, and empty corners often doubled as impromptu restrooms. The Nile itself was also a very convenient option. People bathed in it, washed clothes in it, fished in it, and yes, used it as a giant natural sewer, which raises all sorts of questions about just how refreshing that daily bath actually was. You could go in dirty and technically come out dirtier, just in different ways. Parasites and other delights. Now, here's where things get medically unfortunate. With so much human waste mixing with river water, parasites were a constant issue. Schistosomiasis, a disease caused by parasitic worms, was rampant in Egypt. It spread easily through contaminated water and caused chronic illness, pain, and eventually organ damage. Mummies have actually been tested for these parasites, and the results are very clear. Even elite Egyptians, who had access to better homes and slightly more private toilets, carried heavy parasite loads. It seems that no matter how grand your tomb ended up, life by the Nile meant a lifetime of intestinal discomfort. So yes, pharaohs may have been wrapped in gold when they died, but in life, they were probably just as itchy, bloated, and unfortunate as their subjects. Bathroom rituals and religion. Interestingly, the Egyptians, like many ancient cultures, connected bodily functions with ritual cleanliness. Priests, for instance, had to shave their bodies daily and bathe several times a day to stay pure for temple service. But they also had to manage the more ordinary realities of existence. Some scholars think that certain ritual baths were, in part, about washing off the very literal dirt of life in a city without plumbing. The god Seth, who represented chaos, was sometimes linked to excrement in Egyptian texts, probably because waste was seen as unclean and disorderly. And yet, dung itself wasn't always bad. Animal manure was vital for farming, used as fertilizer. In fact, the very cycle of waste to soil to crop was part of the Nile's eternal rhythm. So while human waste was considered impure, it was also unavoidable. Life, death, and yes, bathroom breaks, all fit into the same cosmic order. Tomb toilets. Yes, really, one of the more surprising discoveries in archaeology has been the occasional tomb toilet. Some tombs, especially those of elite officials, included a small stone toilet seat near the burial chamber. Now, this wasn't meant for actual use. It was symbolic, a kind of just-in-case provision for the afterlife. The logic seems to have been, if you needed food, you'd be buried with food offerings. If you needed clothes, you'd be buried with clothes. And apparently, if you needed the bathroom, well, better safe than sorry. Because the afterlife, glorious as it might be, could still come with its inconveniences. It's an oddly practical touch in a culture otherwise obsessed with eternal perfection. Imagine building the pyramids, carving out vast chambers, filling them with treasures, and then saying, "Don't forget the bathroom. He'll need that too." A final flush of perspective. So, what do we learn from all this? Mainly, that the Egyptians were just like us. They worked, they ate, they worshipped, they built monuments that still tower over us today. But in the end, they still had to find somewhere to sit down and answer nature's call. And they did so with stone seats, ceramic pots, broken pottery shards, and, yes, the occasional handful of sand. It's oddly comforting in a way. These people, who seemed so distant and divine in the carvings on temple walls, were also deeply human. And being human means putting up with things that are never particularly elegant. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, remember this. Every pharaoh, every priest, every farmer by the Nile, they all had the same daily problem to solve. And most of them solved it in ways that would make us deeply grateful for the invention of modern plumbing. Let's gently move on now, away from toilets and parasites, toward another strange corner of history. Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting into one of my favorite corners of history, the endless parade of bizarre medical cures that rulers swore by. Because when you're born into divine right, it only makes sense that your doctors would suggest divine nonsense. Of course, medieval and early modern medicine was mostly guesswork sprinkled with superstition. You weren't sick so much as unbalanced. Too much black bile, too little yellow bile. Your humors were in a mood. And naturally, the cure was rarely something sensible, like resting or maybe eating vegetables. No, it was almost always stranger, grosser, or significantly more dangerous. Let's take a sleepy stroll through royal bedchambers and sick rooms, where treatments ranged from rubbing yourself with pigeons to drinking powdered gems. Yes, actual gemstones, ground down into a fine dust. Because nothing says medicine like swallowing your family jewels. King Charles II and his human skull potion. We can start with England's Charles II, who lived in the 1600s. His court physicians had a favorite cure, all that they called the king's drops. Sounds elegant, right? In reality, it was distilled from powdered human skulls. The theory was that the life force of a dead person could be recycled into you. You'd simply drink this gruesome tincture, made from ground bone and alcohol, and, allegedly, absorb some extra vitality. Charles II actually brewed it himself, like a royal mixologist with very questionable taste. Imagine inviting friends for a drink. Would you like red wine, white, or the skull juice? He was so convinced by this remedy that he even had a distillery in his private chambers. And naturally, since he was king, nobody dared suggest that maybe he should stop drinking corpses. The cure of boiled owl. If Charles II was sipping skulls, his royal colleagues weren't much better. In the Middle Ages, one recommended treatment for gout, the painful swelling in the joints, was to eat boiled owl. You'd stew the unfortunate bird, chew it carefully, and hope that your ankles magically improved. And if owl wasn't available, no worries. Hedgehogs, roasted and eaten whole, were also a fine alternative, because apparently gout could only be fought by turning your dinner plate into a petting zoo. Mary, Queen of Scots, and her bathing obsession. Mary, Queen of Scots, believed that bathing in wine would cure her illnesses, which, to be fair, probably sounded nicer than most medieval prescriptions. Unfortunately, it was also horrifically expensive. Imagine pouring gallons of claret into your bathtub, soaking for an hour, and then asking your servants to pour it all out. It didn't cure her ailments, of course, but it did leave her smelling faintly like a vineyard, which may or may not have been considered regal. Louis XIV and the endless enemas. Then we have Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King, who had one of the most extravagant digestive routines in royal history. Louis was convinced that enemas were the answer to every possible complaint. Headache? Enema. Fever? Enema. Just feeling gloomy? Another enema. At the height of his habit, he was receiving more than 2,000 enemas per year. That's around 5 a day, delivered by doctors in silk gloves, with tubes made of silver and ivory. His court records even mention enemas scented with rose water, because if you're going to obsess over bowel cleansing, you might as well make it luxurious. Strangely enough, Louis lived a long life, which probably made his doctors insufferable. Imagine them bragging, "See? It works. 5 enemas a day keeps the Grim Reaper away." Edward VI and the cure of touch. Meanwhile, England's Edward VI inherited not just the crown, but also the medieval superstition that kings could literally cure diseases by touching people. The most famous was scrofula, a type of tuberculosis that caused swollen glands in the neck. People would line up, often by the hundreds, for the king's healing touch. The ritual included special prayers, the laying on of royal hands, and sometimes even a gold coin pressed into the palm of the sufferer. It goes without saying that this cured no one, but it did reinforce the idea that monarchs were divinely chosen, because clearly, if the king's sweaty hand couldn't heal you, that was your fault, not his. Drinking gold. In Renaissance Europe, another fashionable remedy was to drink liquid gold. Doctors insisted that gold was a perfect substance, untarnished, eternal, and therefore it must contain some healing power. The wealthy elite happily paid to have little flecks, or even melted shavings mixed into their drinks. The result? a sparkling digestive disaster. Gold, as you might guess, is not especially friendly to the human stomach, but it did make your vomit look fancy, which perhaps was the point. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V reportedly tried this golden treatment regularly. Whether it improved his health is debatable, but it certainly improved his jeweler's bank account. The healing power of pigeon butts. Yes, pigeons. In the 17th century, physicians sometimes recommended splitting a live pigeon in half and pressing its warm backside against the head of a sick person. The idea was that the bird would absorb the illness. Royal patients were assured that as the pigeon died, their fever or plague symptoms would lessen, which is both tragic for the pigeon and profoundly unhelpful for the patient. But when you're desperate for a cure, even bird-based nonsense starts to sound reasonable. Queen Elizabeth I and her lead makeup. Elizabeth I wasn't exactly cured by her remedy, but she certainly believed in it. To maintain her famous pale complexion, she used Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic paste made of vinegar and white lead. Lead, as in the poison. She applied it thickly to her face, day after day, year after year. Over time, it destroyed her skin, causing sores and scars, which she then covered with more lead paste. It was a vicious cycle, all in the name of beauty. By the end of her reign, she was almost certainly suffering from lead poisoning, though nobody dared point it out. After all, if the queen wanted to look like a powdered statue, that was her divine right. Powdered mummy flesh. Another royal trend was the belief that consuming ground-up Egyptian mummies could heal illnesses. Yes, actual mummies dug up from tombs, ground into a brownish powder, and sold in jars. This so-called mumia was thought to contain ancient mystical energy. European nobles snorted it like snuff, drank it mixed with wine, and rubbed it into their wounds. If you were especially wealthy, you might even request whole strips of preserved flesh to be boiled into a syrup. It didn't work, of course, but it did lead to centuries of Egyptian mummies being destroyed for Europe's questionable pharmacy shelves. One can only imagine how annoyed the ancient pharaohs would have been to discover their eternal resting places were raided so someone in Paris could rub them on a sore knee. James I and tobacco as medicine. James I of England is remembered for many things, including his hatred of tobacco. Ironically, his court doctors occasionally recommended it as a cure. Tobacco was believed to fight off plague, asthma, and even stomach aches. Some physicians advised royal patients to blow smoke into their rectum as a treatment. Yes, literally. This was called a tobacco smoke enema, which really makes Louis XIV's rosewater version look almost dignified. Conclusion. And so, drifting through centuries of royal medicine, we see a common pattern. Monarchs were treated not with logic, but with whatever nonsense their doctors could sell with a straight face. Ground skulls, boiled owls, gemstone cocktails, pigeon therapy, all proudly administered to the most powerful people in the world. None of it worked, of course, but perhaps that's the secret comfort. Even kings and queens, with all their wealth, influence, and personal physicians, were just as doomed to bad cures as anyone else. So, if you've ever taken a questionable herbal tea or fallen for a bizarre wellness fad, don't worry. You're in excellent company. After all, Louis XIV once had a rose-scented silver tube shoved into him 5 times a day, and he was considered the most magnificent king in Europe. Now, Let's drift gently toward the next chapter of history's bedtime oddities. Hey everyone, welcome back. Hopefully, by now you're comfortably wrapped in a blanket, eyes a little heavy, ready to drift further back in time with me. Tonight, we're gliding into a part of history that doesn't get nearly enough attention. What it was like to grow up in the Middle Ages. Spoiler, not great. Childhood in medieval Europe wasn't really about frolicking in the fields, playing with toys, or learning to ride ponies. It was more about surviving long enough to not die of something mildly preventable. Because here's the thing, being a child in the medieval world was less of a magical stage of life, and more of an awkward waiting room before adulthood. And for most, that waiting room was drafty, unsanitary, and full of diseases with extremely whimsical names. Let's settle in and drift through what it meant to grow up back then. From birth, through play, or lack thereof, to education, and eventually, the charming expectations of adulthood that often arrived before your voice had even changed. Being born. Step 1. Don't die immediately. The first and most important milestone for medieval childhood was, well, actually being born alive. It sounds obvious, but childbirth in this era was notoriously risky. Mothers often gave birth at home, with a midwife and maybe a few women from the community. Forget sterilized instruments or epidurals. If you were lucky, your mother survived. If you were luckier, so did you. Infant mortality rates were astonishing. Depending on where you were, as many as 1 in 3 babies might not make it past their first year. And if you managed to survive that, congratulations, you still had measles, smallpox, dysentery, and mysterious fevers lined up like assassins in a back alley. So when parents baptized babies as quickly as possible after birth, it wasn't just spiritual insurance. It was practical. You wanted that soul saved before the infant caught something from the family pig. Childhood was very short. In modern times, we think of childhood as this long, protected stage: school, friends, hobbies, video games. In medieval times, childhood ended alarmingly early. By the age of 7, most children were considered little adults, not in the sense that they were paying rent, but in the sense that they were expected to start working, learning trades, or at least being useful. The medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas once wrote that by 7, a child had enough reason to distinguish good from evil, which sounds flattering, but really it was just a handy excuse to start giving kids chores. Girls might be sent into domestic service. Boys might work the fields, tend animals, or begin apprenticeships. The idea of a carefree childhood was not a thing. What did kids play with? You might wonder. Did they at least have toys? Sort of. Wealthy children sometimes had carved wooden dolls, miniature knights, or little balls. Archaeologists have found toy horses and even spinning tops. But for most children, play was a luxury. Their toys were sticks, stones, and whatever their imagination could stretch into entertainment. Games of tag, wrestling, and chasing each other around were common, which, frankly, doesn't sound all that different from today, except medieval tag was sometimes played in the middle of streets with open sewage ditches. Adds a certain thrill, I suppose. For richer families, childhood did include formal play. Noble boys might learn to joust with wooden swords, preparing for their glamorous future as cannon fodder in wars. Girls might be taught sewing or music, not exactly roller coasters and swing sets, but it kept them busy. Education, or lack thereof, when it came to schooling, opportunities were slim. Literacy wasn't common unless you were wealthy, male, and destined for the church. Monasteries often ran schools, but they mostly taught boys Latin, scripture, and how to sit silently for hours while contemplating sin. Girls were usually excluded, though noble girls might receive private tutors to learn to read, write, and run a household. Even for noble children, education was wildly inconsistent. A future king might grow up barely literate, while his sister, ironically, could be fluent in 3 languages thanks to her governess. There's no neat pattern. Education in medieval Europe was sort of like a lottery. If you landed in the right family, with the right resources, maybe you got a good one. Discipline and parenting styles. Now, parenting. It's fair to say that medieval child rearing leaned more toward strict than gentle. Children were often seen less as precious individuals and more as potential workers or heirs who needed to be molded quickly. Discipline was physical and immediate. Spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't just a saying, it was a household policy. Parents weren't necessarily unloving, but the emotional side of parenting was different. With high child mortality rates, some scholars think parents deliberately kept a little distance. Why get too attached when the odds weren't great? That sounds cold to us, but in their world it may have been a coping mechanism. Of course, there are records of doting parents too, but culturally, childhood was more practical than sentimental. Work starts early. By age 7 or 8, many kids were already working. Peasant children helped with farming, herding sheep, fetching water, guarding fields. Apprenticeships started shockingly young. A child could be sent to live with a master craftsman, not just to learn the trade, but to serve the household in exchange for food and training. In noble households, boys could be sent to other castles as pages, beginning their journey toward knighthood. They'd spend their days running errands, cleaning weapons, and learning to ride horses. Girls, especially noble ones, were often sent to other noble families too, sometimes to build alliances or simply to learn etiquette and management. Childhood and independence were not synonyms. The unlucky ones, of course, not all children even got that far. Many ended up abandoned, especially if they were born into extreme poverty. Foundling homes and monasteries sometimes took them in, but resources were limited. Some children ended up on the streets, living as beggars or thieves. We even have records of traveling groups of child entertainers, basically small troops of singing or dancing kids, working for coins. And if you're thinking, that sounds unsafe, yes, very much so. But safety wasn't exactly a medieval buzzword. Royal and noble childhoods. Now, we can't talk about childhood without peeking into the lives of royal children. You might assume they had it easier. And in some ways, yes, they had tutors, nurses, better food, and slightly cleaner surroundings. But they also carried the crushing weight of dynastic expectation. Royal children were political pawns. Betrothals could happen before a child could even speak properly. A 6-year-old princess might already be promised to a prince she'd never met, for a marriage 20 years down the line. Imagine being told in kindergarten that your spouse has been chosen for you. And by the way, he lives in another country. Sweet dreams. princes weren't much luckier. From birth, they were expected to embody leadership, piety, and military readiness, which, let's face it, are not common toddler skill sets. Growing up royal meant living in a gilded cage, surrounded by courtiers, hemmed in by etiquette, and constantly measured against an ideal you couldn't possibly fulfill. Many cracked under the pressure. Others just grew weird. Illness. Again. I wish I could tell you things improved as medieval children grew older, but illness never really left them alone. Childhood diseases swept through communities, and medical care was a mix of herbal remedies, prayers, and a healthy dose of trial and error. If you were really unlucky, your doctor might try bloodletting, because clearly, a sick child just needed a little less blood. Coming of age. So when did childhood end? For many, around age 12 to 14. That was when apprenticeships turned into real work. Marriages could begin, and adult responsibilities landed like a sack of bricks. A 14-year-old girl could be married off. A 14-year-old boy might already be on the battlefield. By modern standards, that feels jarring. But in the medieval world, life expectancy was short, and survival required everyone pulling their weight early. Childhood wasn't a stage to savor. It was a hurdle to clear. Closing drift. So, that was medieval childhood. Brutal, brief, and oddly practical. Toys were scarce. Work came early, and childhood illnesses lurked around every corner. Royals might have been cushioned, but even they grew up in a web of pressure and political maneuvering. As you drift further into sleep tonight, imagine that strange, quiet world where childhood ended before it even properly began, where 7-year-olds were put to work, and 14-year-olds were considered marriage material. And remember, if you're still awake, at least you grew up in a world with cartoons, bicycles, and indoor plumbing. Let's drift on now into another corner of history and see what strange habits, decisions, and dynasties waited on the horizon.